Thank you all again for coming out to the Great Smoky Mountain Heritage Center. My name is Logan Hall. If I haven't already met you, hello. I am the Director of Special Events here, so I'm in charge of putting all of these wonderful programs together. But I don't actually do the programming, so I apologize for my introductions. Today we have a very special treat for you. Today is actually Isaac Anderson's birthday. It's his 239th birthday. So after the presentations, we've got cake in the back. But before we get to enjoy that wonderful cake that I keep smelling up here, we've got Dr. Astor, who is a professor at Maryville College, who's going to tell us more about Dr. Anderson and the other founding members of East Tennessee and Tennessee in the college. So without further ado, Dr. Astor.
Thanks so much, Logan, for thanks everybody for coming on out. This is it's a real honor to be able to celebrate Isaac Anderson's 239th birthday. I hope somebody celebrates my 239th. I don't even want to know what I would look like on the candles. This is, of course, a special moment not just for celebrating Isaac Anderson's birthday, but it's a special moment in the history of Maryville College. It's our 200th anniversary. And I think it's a special moment in the history of all of Tennessee. What I'm going to talk about today is not just Isaac Anderson and his importance for Maryville College. I'm going to try to situate him in the context of a group of people who emerged around the same time as Isaac Anderson, who had one thing in common, which was that they were Presbyterians. What that means and why that's significant. And it may be a strange thing to say when I love to talk about how unique and how special Isaac Anderson is and how special his legacy is with Maryville College, but in some ways what made me most remarkable was how he was not alone. There were other really truly remarkable people in his similar social and spiritual and political circles in East Tennessee in the late 18th and early 19th century. Isaac Anderson, if you're not familiar with him, his cabin is right out front by the road. His cabin has been lovingly restored. It was in a neighborhood, apparently, Logan says that the cabin has literally followed her around, which is kind of strange, but amazing how that's happening. But it is thankfully back together in one piece. I don't know how many of you had a chance to be here for the dedication of it, or how many of you have had a chance to take a look inside it. It's worth seeing. It's pretty remarkable that it has remained intact. Isaac Anderson was a remarkable figure. He really was. He was a minister who founded a seminary called Southern and Western Theological Seminary in 1819. That seminary became Maryville College officially in 1842, but really was Maryville College from the very beginning. In fact, as a seminary, it never really took off. It was really a college right from the start. And it, of course, still is. It had a brief interlude during the American Civil War between 1861 and 1866 when the college closed down, as did most colleges in the South, and then reopened thanks to Thomas Jefferson Lamar, who we refer to as our second founder. And it is still a force, it is still with us today. But as I said, Isaac Anderson, I think, is more than the founder of Maryville College. He is, I think, a founder, one of a group of founders, I would argue, for even the state of Tennessee. Which is a strange thing, I guess, to say, because we don't usually think of founding fathers or founders of a state. We think of that for the country, perhaps. Or if we do think of founders for a state, we think of the first governors of the state. We think of maybe John Sevier, or maybe William Blount. Or maybe we think of the Long Hunters who lived in East Tennessee or settled here in the late 18th and early 19th century. But I think that one group of people, the Presbyterians, whether they're Presbyterian ministers or Presbyterian, well, most of them were ministers of some sort, were more important for the state's long-term future than just about anybody else. They offered a vision for the future of the state. They offered a vision of society. They offered a vision of church. They offered a kind of, in a way, almost a ministry that was embodied in the way some of the better institutions and the better traditions of this state developed. So I want to focus on three things here in terms of understanding what I mean here by spiritual founders of Tennessee. I mean is first that they were literally often ministers to the early settlers and leaders of the state. Many of them were, if they were not all Presbyterians, many of them were. The elites of early Tennessee tended to be Presbyterian. In Virginia, they tended to be Episcopalian. In New England, they were Congregationalists, and so on. Quakers in Pennsylvania. And in East Tennessee, they were primarily Presbyterian. They were not only ministers to early settlers and leaders, they were founders of institutions, many of which still survive to this day. Churches and schools, not just Maryville College, but also the University of Tennessee and Tuskegee College, and other colleges in other states too. And they were reformers. They were reformers of their church in the Reformation tradition, but they were reformers of society. In fact, in many ways, building off of John Calvin's notions of reformers, not just of church, but of society. And this included advancing ideals that sadly were rejected as the institution of slavery, for example, became embedded in Tennessee life by the 1820s and 30s. But certainly they were, many of them were ardent advocates for a very different vision of the social order than that. So first, before getting into who these people were, I want to say a little bit about where this all comes from. There are, again, we're thinking rules of three here. I swear this is not supposed to be a pun on trinities, but it's essentially there are three things here. There's of course a theological component. The Presbyterian Church comes from the Reformation and is a particular variety of the Reformation, a particular theology of it. Second, there is a structure of the Presbyterian Church that is distinct, that is unique among the Protestant churches. The fact the very word Presbyterian, which is related to the word elders, is important in understanding how that church is structured, but it also gives a sense of how it's going to engage with the rest of society. And then the third is probably the most sort of ethnic element of all this, is how much of this is connected to Scotland. Maryville College, of course, being the Fighting Scots, but this is the Presbyterian Church is directly connected to the Reformation in Scotland, the Church of Scotland, and the picture up here of John Knox, who was truly the father of the Scottish Reformation in 1560. And not only was the Presbyterian Church rooted in the Scottish Reformation, but the adherents of Presbyterianism and the leaders within the Presbyterian Church almost entirely came from Scotland by way of either Northern Ireland or directly to America. There were certainly Presbyterians who had settled in other places, including England, but the bulk of them came either directly from Scotland to the United States, to North America, I should say, or from Scotland to Northern Ireland, and then their way over here. So, a bit about the Reformation itself. The Reformation was of course, began as efforts to reform the Catholic Church in the West, and there were proto-reformers going back into the Middle Ages, including martyrs like Jan Hus, who was on the bottom right there, who was burned at the stake in 1415. He had the misfortune of there not being a printing press to spread some of his ideas around. The followers of him were able to sort of continue underground and would actually be one of the groups that would make their way to America. In fact, would make their way to Pennsylvania, North Carolina as the Moravians, and are an important part of the early Protestant tradition in America. They were in some ways proto-Protestants. The first sort of most famous successful Protestant, in other words, he survived to not only try to reform, but eventually to break away from the Catholic Church, was of course Martin Luther. We just passed the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther's famous nailing the 95 Theses on the castle door at Wittenberg. But Luther, of course, opened up a can of worms, so to speak, diet of worms. I can't get over the puns. But Luther was Luther, as it turned out, was certainly not the only reformer. Huldrych Zwingli, who's down there below Luther, and several others who had found what will be known as Anabaptist traditions. But certainly the most important other major reformer of the time would be John Calvin on the left. And I'm not going to get into all the theological differences and disputes between them, but just to suggest that John Calvin and what he would refer to as the Reformed Church would be one of the most influential theological figures of the Reformation. And his influence would be felt in a few countries in particular. Certainly, first and foremost in Switzerland, in Geneva, which he had established as essentially a Calvinist town. But then French followers, known as Huguenots, were Calvinists. Dutch followers of his, the Dutch Reformed. The English followers of him, who would refer to themselves as dissenters, but opponents would call them Puritans. And of course, John Knox and his followers into the Church of Scotland. There were other varieties of Calvinist followers, but those were some of the main ones. And then those who took those Reformed traditions around the world. John Calvin is he's known in particular for his vision of God as all-powerful, so powerful that the doctrine of predestination, where the determination of whether one is going to be elected into heaven or not has been predetermined. This was the distinctions between his theology and Luther's are sometimes exaggerated, but certainly this is one of the most distinctive elements of his theology. And Luther's Reformation primarily ended up being restricted to Germany and Scandinavia. And there, by the way, there were also many German Reformed followers too. But the story of John Knox, though, taking this is interesting because we have to realize there's another kind of quasi-Reformation in the mix here, which is in England. England, which famously broke away from the Catholic Church, not because of theological reasons, but because Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce. And that would result in the creation of the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, or in America, the Episcopalian Church, that would be, in many ways, quite similar to the Catholic Church, except for the touch of Rome. In England and in Scotland, there were many who saw this as the opportunity to truly create a Reformed church, and were in many ways horrified by this very, very lukewarm Reformation that was carried into existence through the Book of Common Prayer and the Anglican Church that would emerge in England in the late 16th century. They thought that this was not a real Reformation at all. And the British Isles would be convulsed in religious conflict over the next century and a half over this question of what would count as a true Reformation. John Knox was actually early on a member of this Anglican Reformation, but then his appearance in Geneva and coming under the influence of John Calvin convinced him to push for a more thoroughgoing reform. And in 1560, a series of dramatic events within Edinburgh led to the official break of the Church of Scotland from the Catholic Church. Remember, at this time, Scotland was completely independent from England. And the church, what would eventually be called the Church of Scotland, was created under this, not only this Calvinist theological auspices, but under a structure that would be called Presbyterian. Now, what is it that makes for a Presbyterian church? The Presbyterian church is in many ways a midpoint between two different structures of church organization. On one extreme is a very centralized system that's based around bishops. Certainly the Catholic Church, but also the Lutheran Church, the Anglican Church, and then later the Methodist Church, which grew out of the Anglican Church, have a system of bishops. There's a sort of a much more centralized approach from the top down. On the other extreme is what we call a purely congregational approach, where each individual church is completely independent of every other. Probably the best example of that is the Baptist Church. But in between, in the middle there, is this Presbyterian model, which is based on a sort of a pyramid of sessions, presbyteries, which refers to the elders, synods, and general assemblies. And what's important in all of this, again, without getting into all the details of the Presbyterian organization, is that they did not depend upon a national establishment the way the Church of England did. There was certainly a Church of Scotland, but it could exist and it could thrive even outside of. It did not depend upon the formal backing of a kingdom, the way the Church of England had. So it certainly would thrive in Scotland, but it could thrive elsewhere. At the same time, there was some degree of standards and order. In fact, this was something that Presbyterians emphasized quite often, the importance of order. And the order in particular through ensuring that ministers were properly educated in Calvinist theology and educated at Scottish universities, at St. Andrews, at Glasgow, at Edinburgh, and properly trained in Calvinist doctrine. Eventually, in the 1630s, or 1640s, I'm sorry, a much broader confession called the Westminster Confession would be the document that most Presbyterians, certainly for quite some time onward, would define themselves on, although there would be other catechisms, long and short catechisms and so on, that would define what it means to follow proper Presbyterian order. But the enforcement of this was not necessarily purely top-down or purely bottom-up. It was a sort of a mix of going back and forth. And all along, there was an emphasis upon an educated ministry. And this is going to be one of the most important long-ranging effects of all of this, is that the Scottish Church, or the Kirk, referred to in Scotland, was going to depend upon an educated ministry. That ministers were going to have to be university trained in order to be entrusted with leadership in the church. Later on, as you get into the 17th or into the 18th century, some more secular influences in what we call the Scottish Enlightenment would also influence some of the thinking of some of these leaders. But certainly, again, the importance of this Presbyterian polity. Now, in America, at first, many of the early Presbyterian ministers would expect to go back to Scotland for their training until William Tennant decided to build his own log college, as it was called, to train ministers in the Presbyterian Church in America. And this struggled for a bit. Eventually, this log college was essentially shipped across, in Pennsylvania, was shipped across the river and became known as eventually the College of New Jersey. And later on will be renamed Princeton University, which it still is to this day. Interestingly enough, the Princeton University, while the Princeton University was established here in the 1740s, an actual seminary was not created at Princeton until 1812, which would make it the first true Presbyterian seminary in the United States. The second Presbyterian seminary in the United States would be Southern and Western Theological Seminary, established in 1819, which would become Maryville College. So, of course, the Presbyterian Seminary is still with us. They don't be led by John Witherspoon. Now, I emphasize the importance of an educated ministry and order, but there certainly were many points of this debate and schisms, as there would be in the various churches. Not surprising for a church that believes in reformed and always reforming. There were schisms along many different lines, and historically. There were schisms early on about how strictly one should adhere to this Westminster Confession, about which catechism, long or short, one should adhere to, or whether one should subscribe, subscription controversy they called it, to any of these things, and putting it on the same level as the Bible. Later on, there would be other schisms over style of worship. In the late 1730s, a great awakening came across the land with ministers coming from George Whitefield in particular coming to America and leading these large emotional revivals. And the Presbyterian Church in America was split over whether this was acceptable. Those who had accepted this new emotional style were called New Lights or New Side. And those who had rejected would be called Old Lights or Old Side. And the tenants, William and his son Gilbert Tennant, embraced this new style. But they insisted still that while you could have this emotional style of worship in this new spirit of revival, you still had to have an educated ministry. So it was even that much more important, perhaps, that people would be educated at a place like Princeton. In the turn of the 19th century, shortly afterwards, there was a major backcountry revival in Kentucky. called the Cane Ridge Revival. And this would lead to the creation of new denominations, including what today are the Church of Christ, or the Christian Church, and also a breakaway group of the Presbyterian Church called the Cumberland Presbyterians. And their major difference was they did not believe that you needed to go to have this university training. In fact, those living in the backcountry, those living in places like Tennessee or Kentucky, would have, it was very difficult to get to the proper universities, not even Princeton, but back in Scotland, and that while the population of Presbyterians was growing, or certainly of people of Scots-Irish descent were growing, there just weren't enough educated ministers to serve. And so the risk, as many of the Presbyterian leaders said, is, well, they're just going to leave the church, which many did. They drifted over to other denominations, the Methodists and the Baptists in particular. But the Presbyterian Church insisted certainly that the proper educated ministry was necessary. Later on, you had another series of revivals in the 1830s. And once again, this question arose whether they could accept or not the old school and new school, as they were called. There were, of course, other controversies that split the Presbyterian Church over very, very deep social matters, in particular slavery. The Presbyterian Church was divided, as were all of the Protestant churches in the United States, over the question of slavery, over its concordance with the Bible, over its appropriateness in modern life. And there were vigorous supporters and opponents of slavery within each of these traditions. In Knoxville, the First Presbyterian Church and the Second Presbyterian Church took diametrically opposed positions on the slavery question. Although many actually chose or hoped for a third position, which was silence, to simply not talk about it at all, just simply too divisive. And that's, you know, it was a way to keep the peace on this. I mean, frankly, and this was particularly in the Upper South. I mean, in Kentucky and Tennessee, in Virginia, in Appalachian areas where slavery existed. But slavery was not central to the social order the way it was in the Cotton Belt in the Lower South. And so it was, people could debate this openly. And finally, of course, later in the 19th century and into the 20th century, you had debates over what would be called the modernist fundamentalist divide, which would lead to newer denominations later on. But that's getting way ahead of ourselves. So the point here, of course, is that this as much of the stress on order and education there is in the Presbyterian tradition, these vigorous debates are part of that tradition. And sometimes it does lead to the fracture of the church and the creation of other sub-denominations. But for the most part, the Presbyterian polity and certainly the roots of John Knox's church remain. Let's talk a little bit about the people. The people who settled here, like I said, there were certainly some who came directly from Scotland to America, but the vast, vast majority of those who transferred the Presbyterian faith to America came through really 3 migrations, and this is part of what makes it so complicated. In fact, a colleague who's now at the University of Virginia wrote a book called A People with No Name to describe what were later called the Scotch-Irish or Scots-Irish or Ulster Scots, because there were so many different possible names to give them. They referred to themselves as Irish until Irish Catholics came over in large numbers, and then they wanted to differentiate themselves. But generally speaking, this was a three-part migration. First from the Scottish lowlands, or even the Scottish-English borders, over to Northern Ireland, right around 1600, the very beginning of the 17th century. Well, beginning actually a little bit before that, but primarily when King James of Scotland, King James VI of Scotland in 1603, became the king of a united kingdom of England and Scotland in 1603. And the troublesome border residents along the English-Scottish borders, many of these family names, which are quite familiar, I think, to a lot of us here in East Tennessee, they made their way over to Northern Ireland, just across the Irish Sea, as called plantations in Northern Ireland. There were a variety, like I said, a variety of reasons for this. They had long been distrusted by both the kings of England and Scotland, and were encouraged to make their way across the sea to Northern Ireland, where they would find themselves as a kind of a buffer. And in fact, this would be a common pattern for a lot of these folks. They would sort of be almost used as a buffer between two rival powers. So in some ways you can see them as a buffer between the powers of Scotland and the powers of England. When they moved to Northern Ireland in the 1600s, they once again found themselves as a kind of a buffer, this time between the Catholic Church on the green, on the west, and then the Anglican Irish, which we call the Church of Ireland, it still is, to the east of them. And so while they were praised by the church, by the King of England and Scotland for being Protestant, it would later, as you got into the 18th century, be made clear to them that they were the wrong kind of Protestant, being Presbyterian. There, of course, was also enormous economic difficulties that would face the entire island of Ireland, rack renting, rents going up, and so on. And so beginning particularly around the 17 teens and 20s, you start to see another migration primarily to Pennsylvania. Not only to Pennsylvania, certainly some went to the Carolinas, some went to New Hampshire and elsewhere, but the largest number went to Pennsylvania. And the timing is important here, because if we look at how Pennsylvania is settled, the first group of Quakers around Philadelphia, 1682-83, were mostly English and Welsh Quakers, settled in that southeast corner. And then by the 17 teens and 20s, and then into the early 30s, a large group of Germans settled. These were German Protestants of various confessions. They were German Reformed, they were German Lutherans, they were Anabaptists, Mennonites and Amish and so on. And they had settled largely in the lands, just to think of sort of concentric rings moving further out there. So you see the 1718, that's Lancaster County, primarily, so the Anabaptist communities there. Up in there was the 1733, the Lehigh Valley in Berks County. And my wife's family, which are almost all of what would later be called Pennsylvania Dutch, Pennsylvania Deutsch, are almost all in that area. And the place names go all the way back to those early settlements in that region. There are also, to complicate things, there were also those Moravians who had their roots going back to Jan Hus, who settled, if you see where the 1737 is, where the town of Bethlehem is. And they would found Moravian College, and many of them would eventually make their way to North Carolina and found what will become Winston-Salem. But the Ulster Scots, who came over largely after the biggest waves of Germans did, which meant that the lands available to them were going to be even further out, more where you see the 1736, 49, and 54, which is going to put them once again in a position, a kind of a buffer, a place in between the Germans and the Anglo Quakers to the east and Native Americans to the west. And this unfortunately comes at a time when Pennsylvania, which was established by William Penn as this peaceable kingdom, as this place with this wonderful, peaceful relations with the Lenni Lenape, where that relationship had already broken down. Frankly, William Penn's sons did not have any of the ideals of their father, and there was all kinds of fraud and all kinds of anger about how the Lenni Lenape had been treated. In fact, that 1737 portion, called the Walking Purchase, was really one of the great frauds of the period. The Lenni Lenape became increasingly hostile to the expansion of the white settlers. And of course, who is coming up close to them is going to be these Ulster Scots, finding themselves in a position where they are on the edge, once again, in between two very different peoples. In 1754, a war broke out, right on that same area. In fact, it would become a world war. In Europe, they would call it the 7 Years' War. We would call it the French and Indian War. And this war would culminate at the very end with some of the worst brutality of this war would actually happen at the end. In 1763, the Pontiac's revolt and the Paxton Boys' raid on peaceful Conestoga Indians in Lancaster, who were accused or thought to have been spies, essentially, for hostile Native Americans. The fact is that this borderland here was increasingly difficult. And for those who wanted to continue west, the shape of the mountains was such that it would shunt you to the south and west, not due west, at least for now. And that meant pushing down into the Great Valley. Pushing down into the Great Valley and across Maryland and into Virginia. And so here we go into what is, in essence, the third of the three migrations here. Down the Great Valley here, some of these were Germans and some of these were Scots-Irish. Sometimes they were often intermixing. As time went on, the ethnic nature of things mattered less and less. But they were building different communities as they went south and west down. If you go up Interstate 81 today through Virginia, you're essentially retracing this step. The Carolina Road down there, the Wilderness Road, the Carolina Road, the Philadelphia Wagon Road, which sort of split around what's now Roanoke, where you could go due south up into the Yadkin Valley, where you would have settlements, particularly some of the German settlements, or you could continue southwesterly towards Abingdon, and then eventually into what will become Tennessee. And of course, some of the spiritual leaders of these communities were Presbyterians. What linked these folks together was their adherence to the Presbyterian Church. And Presbyterian ministers would follow on their way down the valley here. The old Providence Church, one of the most important centers on this path down the valley here, was Rockbridge County, named for a natural bridge. Rockbridge County is where the town of Lexington is. And it was evolved as almost sort of a checkerboard pattern of German communities and Scots-Irish communities. And one of the most important of the Scots-Irish communities was Rockbridge County. And this was where, well, there's Augusta County and Rockbridge County, which is where St. Houston was born, and it's also, of course, where Isaac Anderson was born. The Old Providence Church, which is what the later on New Providence Church would be named for. Cyrus McCormick, by the way, would be originally from this area too. Later on, those folks would continue in the southwesterly direction. Charles Cummings would found the Sinking Springs Church as you get closer to Abingdon, closer to the Holston Valley, and then pushing into what's now Tennessee. And these folks would be extremely important during the time of the American Revolution, where Anglicans would often refer to it as a Presbyterian Revolution. So many of the members of George Washington's army were Ulster Scots, were Presbyterians. And there's a reason for this. I mean, the reason for this is that they had been pushed around and abused within Northern Ireland. They had been mistreated pretty much everywhere. They were used as a buffer of various sorts, pretty much wherever they found themselves. And to make matters worse, in 1780, after sort of a series of hit-and-run attacks against the settlements up in what was at the time the westernmost parts of North Carolina, there was a threat essentially to wipe them out. And famously at Sycamore Shoals, Abingdon, and elsewhere, these over-mountain men, as they would kind of be called, would go over the mountains and would surround and wipe out the forces of Patrick Ferguson at the Battle of Kings Mountain, which was in many ways a turning of the tide of the Revolutionary War. 1 year later, almost exactly 1 year later, would lead to Yorktown. But before they met, before they embarked on this journey over the mountains, a Presbyterian minister named Samuel Doak would give one of the most famous battle sermons in American history. A portion of it, "O God of battle, arise in thy might, avenge the slaughter of thy people, confound those who plot for our destruction, crown this mighty effort with victory, and smite those who exalt themselves against liberty and justice and truth. Help us as good soldiers to wield the sword of the Lord and Gideon." This is a much longer sermon, and goes into the details of the threats placed against this community. So, you know, clearly these were the spiritual leaders of this backcountry community. But they were doing more. They were doing more than just simply giving great battle sermons and inspiring people to fight in the revolution. They were also at the very same time building institutions, including in particular not only churches, but also schools. One of which was an academy up around Rockbridge County, up in Lexington, called Augusta Academy at first, and then Liberty Hall Academy. It would eventually be renamed Washington College, and then is now known as Washington Lee University. And this is where Isaac Anderson would get his first training. Many of the early Presbyterian leaders would get some of their first training at that place. So that finally takes us into what will become the great state of Tennessee. These folks were coming in large numbers into what would become Tennessee. And as they were doing so, they were coming in here with a vision. They were leaders of this community. They were certainly spiritual leaders leading the church, but they were leaders of society. They were respected, again, you know, use the term reformed and always reforming, and they were reforming a church and reforming society, which is why I have John Calvin's Geneva on the left, and I threw up Knoxville there. So there's one. Knoxville would be exactly like John Calvin's Geneva, but hey, you know what? It was certainly a very, very important center of Presbyterian settlement. So let me talk a little bit about more of some of these founders, of these key figures here. Samuel Doak, again, who founded the Martin Academy in Washington College, would also be a founder of Tusculum College, who founded the New Bethel Church and the Salem Church, and would be an important anti-slavery advocate. He was a very influential figure. The Doak name is still very important up around Greene County, Washington County, so his influence is very widely heard of, beyond, of course, also his famous sermon back in 1780. Hezekiah Balch and Charles Coffin, you can find a picture of Hezekiah Balch, that is Charles Coffin there at the top, who founded Greenville College, which would eventually merge with Tusculum. Hezekiah Balch was also an important member of the Tennessee Manumission Society, which was an anti-slavery organization. In fact, one of his early students, in fact, was the first African-American, one of the first African-American graduates of the college, was a man named John Gloucester, whose picture is on the bottom there, who would be the founder of the African Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia. It's attributed to being a Tusculum College graduate. Balch was a very important anti-slavery minister. This at a time in the early 19th century when the anti-slavery movement was, there were secular and there were religious elements of this. There were evangelical elements of it, Baptist and Methodist, there were Presbyterian, there were Quaker elements of it. This, of course, represented the Presbyterian element of this, but this was fairly ecumenical. These anti-slavery activists were certainly operating across denominational lines. We have to realize that slavery was until about the 18-teens, there was still an open question of whether slavery would persist in Tennessee. The cotton gin, which really gave the institution a second lease on life, was invented in the 1790s. But no one was really quite sure exactly how profitable it would be, how much it would lead to the true spread of the system of slavery until later in the 18-teens. At that point, there were activists in Kentucky and Tennessee who fought vigorously to end slavery there. We have to realize that slavery initially existed in all 13 original states, and New Jersey was the last of the northern states to get rid of it in 1804. So this really isn't that much later, that if New Jersey only abolished slavery in 1804, for Tennessee and Kentucky to be talking about potentially doing away with slavery in, say, 1810, 1812, it's not exact. I mean, that's sort of in that same time frame there. But sadly, of course, that didn't happen. The cotton trade became too profitable and too powerful, and eventually many of the anti-slavery activists simply left. And I'll mention an example of one later on. Samuel Carrick is another very important figure who is really the guy who teaches Isaac Anderson in Knox County, but is the founder of Blount College, which is the forerunner to the University of Tennessee. Now, Blount College, I think it was 1794, he had literally one student. So, sorry, you're not going to get it didn't work that way. And not only that, it eventually went defunct, I think, around 1807, and then it was reestablished in 1820. Thank you very much. That's after Maryville College. 1820 as East Tennessee College. And that truly is the forerunner to the University of Tennessee. They can claim 1794 all they want, but it's not a continuous run. It's 1820, which is 1 year after 1819. Samuel Carrick was founder of the First Presbyterian Church in Knoxville. That picture on the top is interesting because that's him shearing wool next to Hugh Lawson White, who was a man who ran for president in 1836. Was the son of James White, who was the founder of Knoxville. Hugh Lawson White was in many ways, was the founder of the Whig Party of Tennessee, though he wouldn't call himself that, but his followers certainly were. But that, I think, underscores the importance of many of these Presbyterian ministers as spiritual, their spiritual influence on political leaders within East Tennessee at the time. Although that is kind of a rather humbling face. He's still sad that he lost out to Maryville College by 1 year. Closer to here, Blount County, a man is not as much known about, Archibald Scott, who founded two churches. The story is he founded two churches in one day. Eusebia Church and New Providence Presbyterian Church. The cemetery at New Savior Church has the largest collection of American Revolutionary War soldiers of any in the state, I believe. I'm looking back at George back there. He's probably this information. It's actually quite. Is there a reenactment? There's some event there.
Excuse me.
Is there an event that's going to be there?
This Saturday at 1 o'clock, we will be, the Sons of the American Revolution will be dedicating a monument to the 19 known revolutionary soldiers there, and there may be a couple of 3 more, but that's more than anywhere else in Tennessee.
All right, so that's wonderful. So again, this is a very early Presbyterian church, and again, you can see its connection right here to the literally.
And we'd invite everybody to come.
Yeah, it's free advertising. So again, I mean, he's obviously a very important figure, at least early on in terms of what he establishes. A generation later, Gideon Blackburn, who is really the guy who eventually takes over at New Providence and is the one who welcomes Isaac Anderson to come into Blount County, who does more than, I mean, he would also go on mission to serve the Cherokee population, especially down close to along the Hiwassee. And he would, but then he would move west. He would found the first Presbyterian church in Nashville. Then later on, he would become a leader at Center College in Kentucky, which also, by the way, is having its 200th anniversary this year. And finally, would move on to Illinois. It's Blackburn College in Illinois named for him. Well, again, a reformer of sorts. He sought education and spoke out on behalf of the Cherokee, and was a very, very widely respected figure in his time. Probably the most radical was John Rankin, who's from Jefferson County, and he would become so despondent at the persistence of slavery that he would simply leave and go to Ohio. But he wouldn't just simply leave and go to Ohio. He would become probably one of the most important white station masters of the Underground Railroad. Most of the Underground Railroad, frankly, was run by African Americans, free African Americans in the North. But among white Underground Railroad, John Rankin in Ripley, Ohio, was probably the most important of all. And he's from East Tennessee. He was a Presbyterian from Jefferson County, East Tennessee originally. There's his letters on slavery. And really is one of the founders of the true abolitionist movement, along with William Lloyd Garrison. And by the way, William Lloyd Garrison was the most famously sort of abolitionist leader of abolitionism. He was, as he talked himself, influenced by Benjamin Lundy, who had spent much time in Greenville, Tennessee. So a lot of the abolitionist movement and anti-slavery movement had some important roots established here in East Tennessee. But John Rankin is, I think, one of the most radical. And that takes us full circle back to our man, the birthday boy, Isaac Anderson, who is, just a brief bit about his career, about his life, was born in Rockbridge County, had moved in 1801 to Knox County with his family, and had eventually founded, after he was trained under Samuel Carrick, had founded the Log College, Union Academy, and sort of struggled finding money, but he was an itinerant minister, as many were at that time. And then eventually he was welcomed over into Blount County, over New Providence Church, and founded in 1819 both the Second Presbyterian Church in Knoxville, which is still also celebrating their 20th anniversary, and the Southern and Western Theological Seminary, which would be the second Presbyterian seminary in America after Princeton's, which had technically only been created 7 years before this. Unfortunately, early on, he sought out money from some of his friends at Princeton, and they said, or he sought support from them. They said, "What kind of money do you have?" And I said, "I don't have any." And he said, "Well, see you later. Good luck with all that." Well, 200 years later, we're still running. And Isaac Anderson was a really remarkable figure in that he persisted through all this. And of course, the institution that he founded in downtown Maryville, called, that would eventually be just something known as Maryville College, as I've said before, would survive until the Civil War, when it was closed down and reopened afterwards. And all along, Isaac Anderson, like John Rankin, like many of the others, was an anti-slavery advocate. He was a member of the Tennessee Manumission Society. That's actually his signature on the Manumission Society in the early 19th century. And in fact, one of the very first students that he ever trained was an African-American, was a slave that he had purchased and immediately freed, a man by the name of George Erskine. George Erskine was from Jefferson County. And the story here is quite fascinating. What this document is George Erskine was freed. And then in 1819, George Erskine was able to purchase and free his wife and children. And his daughter, Martha, right there, was, George Erskine and Martha Erskine would, in the later 1820s, be sent as Presbyterian, Isaac Anderson had trained him to be a minister, as Presbyterian missionaries to Liberia. One of the first religious newspaper, called the Calvinistic Magazine out of Rogersville, had a story in 1829, I believe, about the Erskines traveling on their way to Liberia and being celebrated for their voyage onto to Liberia, where they stayed. And later on, in the late 19th century, Martha Erskine at the bottom there famously presented a quilt to Queen Victoria. And so it's a pretty remarkable story in its own right. Isaac Anderson, like Gideon Blackburn, had supported the Cherokee, although had also supported the Creek, which Gideon Blackburn, as far as I know, did not as much, or had difficulties there. He had the Mountain Trail, which was about which would be the road, and they helped to build a road that would go towards North Carolina. Again, Isaac Anderson would train anyone. He was not. He was an educator for all. He was not going to discriminate on the basis of race or gender even, and really established a pattern that persisted with Maryville College up to this day. As we have long, it's something that I think makes for both a legacy that Maryville College is proud of, but I think is very important for the whole state. Maryville College would, as I mentioned before, had African-American students early 19th century, and for a slave state that was pretty remarkable. After the Civil War, Maryville College would graduate the first woman for any college in the state, Mary Tomlinson Wilson on the bottom left. Would also be William Henderson Franklin in the middle there, be an African-American graduate. And when segregation was imposed in 1902, the Maryville College donated a portion of its endowment to create the Swift Memorial Institute in Rogersville, and Franklin was managed that until, and that lasted until 1954, when the Brown versus Board of Education decision was issued, and immediately Maryville College desegregated. Maryville also had many international students, students from Syria and in particular from Japan. Sen Katayama would later on become a real radical reformer and revolutionary, ended up in the Soviet Union, interestingly enough. But then his friend, Kin Takahashi, who was on the left and really exemplified this kind of spirit of service. In fact, we still call it Kin Takahashi Week, a moment of volunteering. It helped to build the first college YMCA in the country, which is now Bartlett Hall. And he also introduced football to East Tennessee in 1889. So Maryville College played football, yes, before university. And he was so I mean, really remarkable, really remarkable. The tradition of opening doors and serving all populations continued, even though with segregation imposed, and serving poor communities. Margaret Henry and Clemmy Henry were head of scholarships and work-study programs, going particularly into the Walker Valley in the mountains, and offering education. And to this day, we certainly we have a sizable population of students that are first generation. So in many ways, these traditions, and that's Anderson Hall, that are there on the right. But as I said, and to finish up here, the story of Maryville College, its founder, is really part of a series of spiritual founders of the state. And these were, what they had in common is they were Presbyterians. They were ministering to a growing population. Some of them stayed inside the fold and some did not. But they built institutions that lasted the test of time, and exemplified, I think, the spirit that serves both the church but also society, being reformed and always reforming. And I think it's something that will probably and hopefully guide many, and hopefully guide these institutions for another 200 years. Thank you very much. With one thing, we are about to, let's sing happy birthday to Isaac Anderson. Before we do that, though, I want to put a plug in for a student of ours who actually has a play called Sturdy as a Rock. It's going to be next week. It's based on the life of Isaac Anderson. We have little flyers in the back there. We'll tell you about ticket information. I want to make sure to mention that. But the next step is going to be singing happy birthday to Isaac Anderson. Should I lead it?
Yes.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Isaac. Happy birthday to you.
Do I have time to take questions? Or? If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take questions.
Well, I've got a comment.
Okay.
Now, granted, I'm an alum, but this was excellent. I mean, it really was. I mean, bringing in not only just the Maryville history, but the things that led up to this. It's just been excellent.
Thank you. That's kind of cool. I appreciate it. Yes.
I understand Isaac Anderson has something to do with building trails and transportation communication through the mountains.
Yes. That would be this. Where are we? Boat Mountain Trail. Yeah, this. The Boat Mountain Trail, which I guess has to do with boat for vote. They voted on what was the appropriate trail to go towards Franklin, North Carolina. There were several different roads over the mountains, and he had helped. Yeah, he helped to build that. So there probably were other ones too. But yes, that's correct. Any other questions? Nobody's thinking about it.
Again, thank you.